The Sound of Damian Wayne. Written by Magnoliabee. Read to you by Evie is Evil. Chapter 6. The last thing on his mind as he sat in his bed, once more scrolling mindlessly through the news, in which nothing notable popped up besides the usual high levels of crime, was his eldest brother. It was a Saturday, and he was cooling off from the gala the day before. He needed to lie low and avoid any further interaction with Tim for the time being. He seemed to be annoyed with Damian. It was a self-centered viewpoint, as if Tim's existence would be nearly enough for Damian to change his whole demeanor. Truly ludicrous. Insulting, really. Damian was above such petty tactics as the utilization of the silent treatment. Revenge was better served in a dish formed with more long-term tactics, in his opinion. He mulled over his plans while he scoured the internet for anything of substance. He couldn't exactly search up things on account of the curse, of course, but it wasn't hard to jump around links to get where he wanted. There were articles about the gala, with such journalistic titles as Bruce Wayne's kickboxing ventures break down doors. He hardly thought his father's supposed hobbies were worthy of the front page. It was while he was scrolling that a notification rang on his phone. It was odd on its own. He didn't get very many messages. Most members of his family didn't bother contacting him personally, but rather went through his father or eldest brother. John was not allowed a device, which was likely for the best when Damian considered the times John borrowed his mother's or father's phone to bombard Damian with truly unimportant messages. He knew who it must be, as there was no one else who it could be. And still he felt a slight flash of what he must be mistaking for nerves course through his body. He swiped up on the notification, and his breath caught as he read the name. Richard, 11:16. Hey, Damie, just wanted to ask how you've been, and let you know that I'll swing by Gotham in a week or two. Smiley face. He didn't dare open the message, knowing he had his red receipts on, and that was something Dick paid attention to. There had been quite a few times Dick had lamented to him that it was so cruel of his youngest brother to not respond to his texts. Not that he was the only one to do it. He's pretty sure all of them have ignored one another online before. Dick was just the usual target, seeing as he sent the most messages. Damian took his time to reflect on his possible choices. He couldn't just not respond. Dick would get too suspicious, but he surely couldn't answer in more explicit detail. Damian, 11:23. Good. He had learned to brace for the hit, but it was a difficult thing to do when he had no idea where it might come from. This time, it was on his calf, and he pulled up his pant leg to inspect. A new purple spot was blooming. Truly irritating. It might have been a clipped response, but it could be taken as an answer for both of Dick's statements. Good, in reference to his current state, and good, as in Dick's planned appearance. It felt like enough was said in his mind. There was not much else to comment on, and he hoped it was the end of that. Of course, that was a tall order to be making. Richard, 11:24. Good? Is that all? What's up? He cursed Dick in his uncanny ability to detect when something was off. Damian did not know how to answer. He couldn't deflect Dick's prodding so easily, but it would be hard to get him off his trail in a one-word format. His fingers hovered above the small keyboard, at a standstill. Damian, 11:31. Nothing. The pain splintered up his side, and he cringed at the placement. The bruises were not particularly large, usually around the size of a small post-it note, though some were beginning to clump together in a way that would potentially, one day, be large enough to resemble fists. Surely Dick was not worthy such a fate, and yet he couldn't let himself leave it be. While, yes, he would have raised concerns with the man if he'd failed to give any reply, it had more to do with the fact he, on some level, would have pitied Dick. It wouldn't be that unusual for Damian to ignore the man. Damian was just simply being rational. He didn't want his eldest brother to have any ongoing concerns about him. Richard, 11:32. All right. I'm working on a case in Bloodhaven, so I might be out of reach for a bit. If you need to contact me, call the burner number I gave you a while back. I'll pick up." Damian knew very well he had no intentions of ever calling the phone, but still proceeded to like the message in the chat anyway.
An action that elicited no repercussions, which he filed away in his mind.
He was not pleased with Dick's potential reappearance, a thought that hurt to acknowledge, because while he was able to brush off his father and Tim, a constant presence of Dick's pushy self would be a struggle to navigate. Cass had indeed disappeared in just the way he had suspected she would. As Tim had grumbled, she was out with Steph on the drive back to the manor. Bruce had merely stated she had worked a deal out with him. This particular factoid was startling. His father knew how much he detested social events, and yet he did not get to leave early. He caught himself fuming as a child might, wondering why Cass, who went to many fewer galas than him, was given such an arrangement. Perhaps he simply did not push back with enough force, he supposed. There would be time for that one day, and reasonably, Cass wasn't home as much anyway. Why would there be any expectation for her to be around for galas? He had wondered offhandedly if his mother would have anything helpful in removing the curse. She likely would have more resources, but contacting her was another matter. He did not want to overly concern her by leaving a one-word message, and he did not know what he would do with himself if she were without answers. If his mother could not fix things, then he was surely without hope, and he could not so soon succumb to such a level. His stomach growled, causing him to be pulled from spiraling. It had been a bit since he'd eaten, the last thing being the bruschetta from yesterday, he realized. That was teetering on much too long. He finally got up, pushing his door open to scrounge for a meal. He felt like some sort of vermin in his own home, keeping himself unseen and unheard. This feeling isn't helped as he snuck into the large and overflowing pantry carefully. There were many unopened bags of ingredients, and as well as, more importantly, snackable items. He plucked a small bag of chips, stuffed into the corner, either Dick or Steph's handiwork. They were already open, but had been clamped shut, so he wasn't too worried about them being stale. It was at the kitchen counter, hunched over a bag of chips, that his father found him. Damian looked up, surprised to see his father in the room. On weekends, he was usually still busy, working on cases or all the dealings that came with being the owner of such a large company. His father raised an eyebrow, but did not question his meal choices. "I'll be gone for a few days next week. The Justice League has an annual conference, so I will need to be there for that." Damian nodded along as he spoke, and watched as he picked up a loose file he had left there, which was surely the reason he had come into the room. Not for Damian. Never. His father left as assertively as he had entered, not even sparing a glance behind him as he opened the file. Damian kept an ambivalent demeanor, but internally his fears rose to unforeseen heights. Because what was he supposed to do now? His open house was that week, a mere few days away. A Wednesday. He would hazard a guess that his father's trip would overlap with that particular event. It wasn't that he necessarily cared if his father showed up or not, but it would be shameful to be alone. He knew Alfred would go, if need be, but he didn't want to bother the man, and having to explain who the butler was to his school wouldn't be possible. Alfred wasn't one for the limelight, having managed to stay largely out of the prying eyes of the public. Damian didn't want to disrupt that for something so insignificant. Dick wasn't around, Cass was busy, Jason was still technically dead, and Tim? He wouldn't want to go anyway. All logical. What really did sting, however, was that his father hadn't even mentioned the issue of the open house. The flyer had been on top of his computer. There was no way it could have gone unseen, unnoticed. And perhaps that was the cruelest joke. He hated the woman, the witch, sorceress, whatever she was. It didn't matter because he hated her and everything she stood for. She'd shown her face at such a high-security event, had spoken with Red Robin, and had gone unnoticed. Why she was there was another question that would likely remain unanswered, at least for a while. She had to have been looking for something, as she had no reason to be meandering through such an event when the risks were so high. It was also notable that she had such odd conversations with Tim. It had been obvious that she hadn't realized Damian was Robin until she sensed her own spell. So she wouldn't have had that as a reason to speak with Tim. She'd been laughing and had seemingly gained some confidence since he'd last seen her. He wondered bitterly if having succeeded in thwarting him to such a degree had given her a sense of pride, an egoism that he did not think suited her. She had to have been scoping something out, but he wasn't certain what it could be. He reasoned that from her actions, when she'd been looking around, she must have been searching. He couldn't imagine what that could be, however. Nothing had seemed off at the gala. No odd feeling in the depths of his stomach, or electric feeling in the air. All things he'd come to associate with unease. It bothered him, but he didn't have much else to do but wait for things to escalate. She wasn't exactly going to walk into his life so easily again. Monday had long ago become Damian's least favorite day. It started the week of work and school, marketed as some sort of fresh start, as if the week before was suddenly inconsequential. He glared at Dr. Dahlman as the man placed a deck of cards in front of them. His tattered jacket was off for once, thrown over his chair to reveal a hideous graphic t-shirt of some old rock band. September was giving her last kick of sweltering heat, a rarity in Gotham and decidedly miserable. He'd grown up in a place with many different temperature extremes, but somehow Gotham was worse. Because Gotham heat made people furious, creating a rancid scent of grime and sweat that polluted the city's air as the day dragged on. The fan was blasting in the counselor's office, the window slightly ajar for hopes of a wayward breeze spilling in. One of the posters on the wall was peeled slightly from the broiling temperature. It was one of Robin, and surely that was not auspicious. He shifted in his chair, wishing to remove his school jacket, but acutely aware that it was a horrible idea, if terribly tempting. "I bought a new game," Dr. Dahlman supplied as he shuffled the card deck, fumbling slightly with the motion. "I thought you could help me decide if I could leave it out for the rascals who come in here." The man was useless. Not even able to discern the appropriateness of a simple card game without an outside opinion. Damian nearly gaped when he took a closer look at the cards, and noted that they were from what appeared to be a Superman-themed Uno deck. Surely the man was not serious. Damian did not particularly enjoy such pursuits, but even he knew what Uno was. "I looked up the rules. Do you know them already?" He asked, this without glancing up, carefully counting out the proper amount of cards for them to start. "They're pretty easy once you get into the swing of things. I practice on my own." And wasn't that an image? The idea of the counselor hunched over a deck of childish cards, instead of working, was amusing to some degree. He could just imagine some blubbering child having to wait outside their room as Dr. Dahlman figured out how a skip card functioned. Damian snatched up his deck and sent a withering gaze over his cards to Dr. Dahlman, who remained aloof, a smile on his face as he sipped at his tea. At this point, Damian had gotten pretty familiar with the room. Not that he visited very often, only twice now, but he prided himself on his observational abilities. He knew where the cleaning supplies were when the counselor had spilled a bit of coffee on the table while they had been drawing. He knew the grooves of the slightly lopsided chair he was instructed to sit in each time he came in. Knew the markers and posters to the point he could confidently navigate the room without sight if need be. He knew this was a place to be on edge, and that observation was key to survival. What that looked like exactly, he remained uncertain. He was surprised no calls home had been made. Not yet, anyway. His behavior could reasonably be marked as concerning. He knew that. There wasn't much correction he could do, however. Maybe there was a reason for the lack of contact with his father from the school, but one he could not place. "All right, let's see how this goes." Dr. Dahlman chuckled good-naturedly and picked up a card to flip over and begin the game. It was almost too easy for Damian, as he placed skip cards and handily won the first round. He didn't say Uno, as the game required, but the counselor didn't point it out, and so neither did he. He found himself staring off as the game progressed. Dr. Dahlman took card after card from the deck, which was an arduous process. He couldn't help but think about Dick. His brother and his text messages were able to curb the frigidity of his days with his warm manner of speaking. Admittedly, and only to himself, was this ever to be acknowledged, he missed him. When he'd disappeared to Bloodhaven or somewhere far and distant, only leaving pleasant memories for Damian to grasp onto as he left. He had a life, and that was all well and good. It would be selfish to expect him to be around all the time. He'd been called self-centered more times than he could count on, and perhaps he wanted to believe that, to convince himself to be thinking only of himself and not care about how Dick would feel trapped in Gotham with him. "Damian, are you there?" A concerned voice pulled him out of his thoughts, and it was then he realized he must have been daydreaming once again. He glanced at the deck and slapped his card down. A wild. He pointed at the green part to indicate his choice. Dr. Dahlman frowned softly, a twitch so minuscule that anyone else wouldn't have noticed. But Damian was trained to perceive such things, and knew it couldn't be a good sign. "You're good at this," the man said offhandedly, indicating it was just small talk. "Do you play with anyone in your family?" He shook his head before he could stop himself. Game nights usually didn't end well at the manor, with a board being tipped over on many occasions, by a more immature version of himself sometimes. They tapered off in commonality, and he couldn't remember the last time one had occurred. Dr. Dahlman nodded along and placed another card down. "Are they around a lot?" He fiddled with his cards, head down so Damian couldn't see his expression. Again, such an asinine question, and surely he knew the answer as Damian hesitantly shook his head, wondering what the man could possibly be getting at. It wasn't out of the ordinary for someone like him. His father had a company to run, and so did his brother. The public knew Dick lived in a different city, and that Cass was usually gone anyhow. Most of his classmates probably saw their parents on an inconsistent basis. The counselor hummed, plucking a card up from his oversized deck and placing it down. After that, there were no more questions, and it befuddled Damian why this man so greatly insisted on meeting with him, and wasted his time. There were more troubled children. He kicked his feet under him absent-mindedly, the chair too high in his opinion. He was stiff as he placed cards down, the aches in his body loud as he shifted. The heat was still suffocating, a slight humidity in the air that was heavy to inhale. They played one more round after this, and finally he was released as that glorious school bell echoed through the halls. "Damian, I have some homework for you." He was stopped in place at the doorframe, one strap of his backpack thrown carelessly over his shoulder, threatening to fall off if he wasn't paying attention. He looked back at Dr. Dahlman, who had his elbows on his desk in a boorish way that wouldn't fly at any high-end events. "Print out a photo of something you like at home. Doesn't matter what, as long as it makes you happy. Got it? Have it in your backpack when I call you next time." Damian waved a hand as assent and hurried out the door, not wanting to be late for his next class. He sat at his desk, staring at the pen and paper before him. There was a dryness in his throat as he swallowed, picking up the drawing utensil gingerly. This could be his breakthrough, his method of communication, and the idea was so powerful in his mind, consuming him, that he considered what to create. He planned to draw the witch, then a picture of himself, perhaps crossing out his throat or drawing an empty speech bubble. There was no need for metaphorical imagery. The more straightforward, the better in his eyes. He let out a breath, unsure why his heart was pounding so erratically in his chest. His pen swooped timidly across the page, a circle to begin plotting out the shape of her skull. It had to be perfect. His entire focus was on putting down what he remembered about her. A rather easy feat, admittedly, from the way she plagued his dreams at night. For this reason, It did not occur to him to brace himself in any way, because he'd been able to create before. Why would that suddenly change? A thrum of pain bloomed on his hip, and he couldn't help the noise that slipped out in his surprise. He dropped the pen, staring at it as if it had burned him. His hands shakily fumbled towards his waistband as he tugged it down slightly to reveal a dark bruise. It didn't make sense. Why was he able to draw before, and yet now things differed? He grabbed another piece of paper, quickly striking a large line across it. He waited for the pain, and yet it failed to pass. Confused, he snatched up his previous page and tried to draw the woman's jaw. He got no further than a line before another ache seared across his body. His hands tightened around the paper, the edges crumpling as he stared at it. This did not make sense. He had been able to draw previously. A mountain, his family, and even a small sketch of the woman. So what was different this time? Damian tapped his hand on the paper as he stared at the drawing. He bit his lip as he thought. His eyes glanced toward the pile of homework that would never be done, sitting on his desk. It was in this state that he realized something, his brows lifting slightly and his eyes narrowing. There seemed to be an issue of intent that changed the outcome, or purpose. The details were surely up for change in his mind. He considered that perhaps he was overtly meaning to communicate something, and that would trigger the spell, which explained why he could still make noises, yet sign language and even some forms of art would not be accepted. But it was inconsistent, with head nods and body language not setting things off. And wasn't that entirely frustrating? How was he supposed to even subconsciously try and communicate? And wouldn't that also count too, hypothetically? It truly did seem hopeless on some level. He was stuck doing the reconnaissance alone, until someone looked deeper into his actions. And there was no telling how long that would take. Never mind if it would ever happen. He wondered why the witch would choose such a strong spell. It was logical, and yet so utterly and undeniably cruel. He ripped open his bag, searching for the drawing he had made of the witch in an unthinking state. And yet it was not there. He had emptied the bag earlier, and surely he must have placed it somewhere on his desk. He distinctly remembered doing so, but it was nowhere to be found. He slumped in his chair finally, throwing his head back in exasperation, furious at his luck. Of course he had lost the drawing. So typical. His head thrummed dully, and he groaned as he felt the onset of a headache. Odd, but he could easily chalk it up to sleep deprivation. A bird squawked outside his window, and he glanced over to see a solitary black crow sitting on a branch. He sighed and stood up, throwing himself onto his bed. He lay there on his back, staring up at his ceiling. There was a spiderweb-shaped crack in the corner, from a time he had tried to practice with a sword while on bed rest, and the hilt had gone shooting skywards. Besides that, it was dark and boring, and yet an old friend at this junction. His body ached, no more than it ever had, but in a way that was notable to some degree. He held his arm up and brushed down his sleeve to stare at it. The bruises were the same as when he had gotten them, and, as suspected, still hurt the same as he tested out one with a light tap. It was interesting in a morbid way. Bruises were spots where blood vessels had broken. The ones he had weren't growing, but merely staying stagnant. He almost worried that the spell had somehow messed with his body's anatomy in some way, but quickly shook the thought away. If the witch could detect her spell on him, it had to be continuous, which was obvious. But specifically, it was constantly active, likely to ensure his bruises stayed. It was a nasty curse. He wondered if the woman had even known the true side effects, and had been aware of what it all entailed for him. He doubts whether any of it would bother her. More likely, she'd find it fascinating and note it down, and of course taunt him more. Damian knew that he needed to find a magic user to help him, but there weren't any he knew well enough. None of them would drop what they were doing and visit without proper reasoning he undoubtedly could not supply. The point of the spell had indeed been isolation. He just hadn't thought it would affect him so much. And that is the end of Chapter 6. Author's notes. Okay, so moving all of these theories people have about the spell. I know the parameters seem confusing right now, and the witch's motives as well, but there is a reasoning behind it all. Also, I know it's upsetting no one has noticed, but trust they care. Sorry for the break. Exam season hit me like a truck, and some other things, so I took a break from, well, online stuff. But I have up to Chapter 9 pre-written, so updates should go back to being consistent. I will be replying to all comments, especially those left on the chapter before. And don't worry, not that you were there, but I was. Sorry again. Thank you for reading. And reader's notes? My voice definitely started to fail me at the end here. This is my 3rd chapter of recording in one night. So I'm definitely pushing my voice here, but we're good. I'm gonna have them all done. I have an entire week to edit, and an entire week to find a one shot and record it, and an entire week to catch up on to add a buffer, So that'll be nice. But yeah, thanks for listening. Bye.